The year is 717 AD. You're standing on the ancient walls of Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world. Behind you, a million souls huddle in prayer. Before you, an armada of 1,800 Arab warships darkens the horizon like a swarm of locusts. 200,000 enemy soldiers are camping their tents around your city walls. The Caliph himself has declared this will be Islam's greatest conquest, the final jewel in a crown of victories that has already swallowed Jerusalem, Damascus, Alexandria, and half the known world. Everyone knows Constantinople will fall. Everyone except the people inside. This is the story of how one city changed the course of human history by refusing to die. For nearly a century, the Arabs had been unstoppable. Since the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, his followers had exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula like a fire consuming dry grass. The mighty Persian Empire? Destroyed. The wealthy provinces of Roman Syria, Egypt, and North Africa? Gone. The Mediterranean Sea itself was becoming an Arab lake. Constantinople had watched, year after year, as the Islamic tide crept closer. The Byzantines, as historians would later call them, had already lost two-thirds of their empire. Every summer brought new defeats, new refugees streaming through the gates with tales of cities that thought themselves impregnable, now filled with mosques. The Arabs had tried before. In 674, a massive fleet had besieged Constantinople for 4 brutal years. But the city had a secret weapon, Greek fire, a mysterious chemical mixture that burned on water itself, turning the sea into liquid flame. The Arab ships had retreated, their timbers still smoking, their sailors traumatized by watching their comrades burn in water that offered no refuge. But that was then. Now, in 717, the Arabs returned with a new caliph, Suleiman, and a new general, his brother Maslama. They had learned from their defeat. They brought supplies for a long siege. They brought engineers who understood siege warfare. And they brought something more dangerous than any weapon: absolute certainty that Allah had destined them to conquer the Queen of Cities. Inside Constantinople's walls, terror gripped the population. They had reason to fear. Every other great city of the ancient world had fallen to these warriors. What made Constantinople different? If you're fascinated by the stories of how ordinary people faced extraordinary moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to History Incomplete. We're digging into the human drama behind the dates you learned in school, the fear, the courage, the impossible choices. Hit that subscribe button because this siege is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Constantinople wasn't just any city. It was a fortress built by paranoid emperors who understood that one day everything would depend on these stones. The Theodosian walls, named after the emperor who'd built them 3 centuries earlier, were the greatest defensive system the world had ever seen. 3 layers of walls, each taller than the last. The outer wall rose 40 feet high, studded with 96 towers. Behind it, a second wall reached even higher. And behind that, the inner wall, massive, ancient, impregnable. But walls alone don't win sieges. People do. Emperor Leo III had just seized the throne in a military coup the year before. He was a soldier, not a nobleman, a man who'd risen through the ranks by being harder, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone else. When he looked out at the Arab host assembling around his city, he didn't see defeat. He saw a problem that needed solving. Leo's first move was brilliant and brutal. He ordered every scrap of food in the countryside brought inside the walls or burned. Every well poisoned, every farm destroyed. If the Arabs wanted to starve Constantinople, they would starve themselves first. Then he waited. The Arab fleet arrived in waves, their sails filling the Sea of Marmara like white clouds. Maslama's army encircled the land walls, their campfires stretching to the horizon. The siege engines rolled forward, enormous towers on wheels, catapults that could hurl stones the size of sheep. The Arabs began their assault with the confidence of men who'd never failed before. They smashed themselves against Constantinople's walls like waves against a cliff. The defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew what happened to cities that surrendered. Byzantine soldiers poured boiling oil from the battlements. They dropped stones that crushed men in their armor. Archers fired until their fingers bled, then kept firing. Every scaling ladder that touched the walls was pushed back, men screaming as they fell 40 feet onto rocks below. Day after day, the Arabs attacked. Day after day, they were thrown back. But Maslama was patient. He had supplies for a long siege, or so he thought. As summer turned to autumn, a terrible realization crept through the Arab camp. The harvest they'd expected never came. Leo had destroyed it all. The supply ships from Egypt and Syria that were supposed to sustain the siege, Byzantine warships armed with Greek fire intercepted them, turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard of burning hulks. Winter arrived early that year, and it was merciless. Snow fell on men who'd grown up in desert heat. The temperature plunged below freezing, and Arab soldiers who'd conquered empires found themselves huddled in tents, watching their fingers turn black with frostbite. Horses began dying first, then the pack animals, then the men. Inside Constantinople, conditions were barely better. Food was rationed. The bread grew darker as wheat ran low, and other grains, barley, oats, whatever could be ground into flour, were mixed in. People grew thin. Children stopped playing in the streets. The churches overflowed with prayers in the desperate sick, but the walls held. This is the kind of story they don't tell you in textbooks. The grinding reality of medieval siege warfare, where victory went not to the bravest or the strongest, but to whoever could endure suffering the longest. If you want more stories about the real human cost of history's turning points, subscribe to History Incomplete. We're committed to showing you history as it actually felt, not just how it looked from a distance. Subscribe now because this siege is about to take a shocking turn. Spring arrived, and with it came hope for the Arabs. A new supply fleet was sailing from Egypt, packed with grain and fresh troops. Maslama's spies told him it would arrive within weeks. All he had to do was survive a little longer. But Leo had spies too, and he'd made them an offer they couldn't refuse. When the Arab supply fleet entered the Bosphorus, something strange happened. Ships at the rear suddenly turned, ramming into their companions. Captains who'd sworn loyalty to the Caliph were now setting fire to their own vessels. Leo had bribed them, promised them wealth and safety if they switched sides at the crucial moment. The betrayal was devastating. Ships collided in confusion. Crews fought each other on burning decks. And then the Byzantine fleet emerged from Constantinople's harbors. Greek fire siphons mounted on their prows like the heads of dragons. What followed was slaughter. The mysterious substance, a mixture probably containing petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur, shot from bronze tubes in jets of liquid flame. It stuck to wood, to cloth, to human skin. It burned on water, so jumping overboard meant dying in agony as the sea itself became fire. Arab sailors who'd faced death countless times before broke completely, jumping from ships still docked, trampling each other in terror. The screaming carried all the way to Constantinople's walls. The defenders watched the water burn and allowed themselves to hope. By summer, the Arab army was disintegrating. Starvation had become catastrophic. Soldiers were eating their horses, then their leather boots, then the bodies of their dead comrades. Disease swept through the camp. Dysentery, typhus, plague. Men who'd conquered kingdoms now lay in their own filth, too weak to stand. Maslama tried everything. He launched assault after assault, throwing his dying men at the walls in desperate gambles. Each attack was repulsed with greater ease than the last. The defenders could see their enemies weakening, could smell the death in the Arab camp carried on the wind. Then came news that changed everything. The Bulgar tribes to the north, traditional enemies of Byzantium, had decided that an Arab conquest of Constantinople wasn't in their interest either. A massive Bulgar army was marching south, intent on attacking the Arabs from behind. Maslama finally understood what Leo had known from the beginning. He'd been baited into a trap. Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was a killing ground designed to destroy anyone foolish enough to siege it. In August of 718, 13 months after the siege began, the Arab fleet weighed anchor and sailed away. Of the 1,800 ships that had arrived, fewer than 5 returned. Of the 200,000 soldiers who'd camped outside the walls, perhaps 30,000 survived the journey home. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Inside Constantinople, the bells rang for 3 days straight. People poured into the streets, weeping, embracing, unable to believe they'd survived. Emperor Leo III processed through the city to the Hagia Sophia, where he gave thanks to God for the deliverance of Christendom. Because that's what it was. If Constantinople had fallen in 718, the history of Europe, of the world, would have been unrecognizable. The Arabs would have had a foothold in Europe proper, a launching point for further conquests. The Germanic kingdoms to the west, still primitive and disorganized, would have faced an enemy infinitely more sophisticated and battle-hardened. Instead, the siege broke the momentum of Arab expansion. They would never again threaten Constantinople with such force. The Byzantine Empire, bloodied but unbroken, would survive another 7 centuries, preserving the classical learning and Christian traditions that would eventually spark the Renaissance. The siege of Constantinople is one of those pivot points where you can actually see history turning on a single event. What if the walls had broken? What if Leo had fled? What if the winter had been mild or the Bulgars had stayed home? These questions haunt historians because we know how close it came, how a few thousand defenders changed the entire trajectory of Western civilization. If you love exploring these crucial moments where everything hung in the balance, where individual courage and strategic brilliance shape the world we live in today, then History Incomplete is your channel. Subscribe now because there are dozens more of these stories waiting to be told. The moments of desperation, brilliance, and sheer human will that textbooks reduce to single sentences. Don't let history stay incomplete. Subscribe and let's explore it together. The defenders of Constantinople in 718 didn't know they were saving Western civilization. They just knew they were trying to survive another day, another assault, another winter. They were shopkeepers and soldiers, priests and prostitutes, noblemen and beggars, all united by the simple fact that they were inside the walls when the enemy arrived, and they refused to surrender. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.